Okay, so we are going to move on to talking about preschoolers, those fun little children just past toddlerhood. So just like we talked about with the toddlers, we're going to address it from promoting the optimal growth and development. So we'll start off with the biologic development. So the weight and height growth have slowed a little bit during this stage, and their bodies are evolving from that wide, on steady stance that toddlers have to being more graceful and posturally erect and a little bit more sturdy on their feet. We want to be sure to promote good posture, because this is the stage where they're starting to stand up more straight. And so if we can promote that early on, they'll have better posture throughout their life. We also want to promote good nutrition, adequate rest, appropriate exercise, to help these little bodies keep growing. So most of the organ systems at this point in time are able to adjust really well to all sorts of different stress. The only system that we're really going to be cautious of, I guess would be the best word, is the musculoskeletal system. It's still in a critical growth period, and injury can drastically affect the growth of that skeleton. The gross and fine motor skills are growing exponentially at this time. Preschoolers can walk, run, climb, ride a tricycle, walk in their tippy toes, balance on one foot. By 5, they can jump rope, even skateboard, and they are really great little swimmers if we teach them how to swim. So in their fine motor skill development of tasks such as getting dressed and drawing with a pencil or a pen are going to continue to refine and develop during this time. When they complete those tasks, they feel really good about themselves. So we want them to, although it might be frustrating for them, we want to encourage them to complete the tasks on their own. When we're looking at their psychosocial development, we have Erickson's initiative versus guilt. And this kind of plays into what I was just talking about helping them to complete those tasks, even though they're frustrating, or encouraging them to do it on their own. They want to learn, but they don't have the physical ability to do all the tasks that we want them to. And that they want to do at that time. So we need to encourage them to keep trying so that they can develop that initiative, as opposed to the guilt of not achieving the actual tasks. They feel good about themselves when they're able to complete the task adequately. During this time, we might see some regression related to stress, just like at any point in time. So if we see regression, or parents are speaking of regression that lasts more than probably a week, we're going to want to explore that a little bit further for what's been going on in this child's life. What is stressing them out? And as mandated reporters that you all are as student nurses, and then when you become a nurse as well, you want to keep an eye out for things like this, and for parents who communicate this, because this could be a sign that some sort of abuse is going on. It might not be the parents who are the abusers. It might be somebody else, but we'll get more into that a little bit later in this lecture. We see for Kohlberg's moral development that we still have the good versus bad, and the older preschoolers are going to act more on their personal needs, but understand where others need things as well, to where the younger preschoolers are going to act primarily just on what they want and what they need at that time. There's development of the superego, or the conscience starts at this time. We also have a lot of conscious behavior that's starting to take place, as opposed to just reacting. They somewhat think about what they're going to do before they do it, which is the development of the superego is the huge task associated with this developmental stage. And when we're thinking about the preschooler in the hospital setting or in the medical setting, one thing that we want to keep in mind is they don't have that understanding of how the body works. And Band-Aids are of utmost important to preschoolers, especially if you're doing immunizations, because they feel like if their skin opens, all of their blood's going to flow out of their body. So that's a thought that processes through their head. So helping them understand that the band, that one, it's not going to happen, and then giving them the Band-Aid to give them reassurance that, okay, now we've stopped it, we've closed it, is going to be very reassuring to them. It's amazing what a Band-Aid can fix for little preschoolers. So moving on to cognitive development. With cognitive development, we're looking at Piaget, we're looking at the pre-operational phase, and they're transitioning into intuitive thought. We're going to go from egocentric to social awareness, and the ability to consider other people's viewpoints, which is a huge task for these little preschoolers. They have preschoolers start to make judgments about other kids, mostly based upon appearance, because that's what they can most readily relate to and most readily pick out at this point in time. And I think we've all heard, kids are mean. Kids are mean because they say, they have no filter, essentially. So if a child has a birthmark on their face, then that's going to be brought up by the other children, and they might call them names or make fun of them because of that. So when we have a child who might have something like that, we want to communicate to the parents to help that child be able to cope with those things and have little ways to diffuse it. Because I think that when the child who has the birthmark, as an example, is able to be proud of it and is able to address it before it's made fun of, then that situation isn't quite as much fun for the preschoolers to pick on them. They also have magical thinking, which is not what you're thinking it is. So when I think of magical thinking, just outside this context, I think of, everything's magical and fantasy land. And although preschoolers do have that type of thinking, magical thinking refers to the fact that they think their thoughts can make things happen. So if they have a bad thought about their friend, and then their friend falls down and gets hurt, they're going to think that they made that happen. So these are discussions that those preschoolers and the parents are going to have, and something that we can pass on as healthcare providers to the family members, so they understand where this little guy's coming from. They also like to attribute lifelike qualities to inanimate objects, and it's called animism. And animism is, it's playing tea party with a bunch of stuffed animals and applying those, making the little bear drink. So applying those lifelike things to inanimate objects. They're going to focus on one thing. So they're very, have centers in thinking to where they cannot get past the one thing that they want to think about. So when parents are dealing with that, they need to address that one thing before they're able to move on, because the preschooler is going to focus in on that. They start to being able to understand times. So not necessarily what 20 minutes means, but time in a sequence of events. So they understand that in the morning they have breakfast, in the afternoon they have lunch, in the evening they have dinner and bedtime. So starting to see how the sequence of events occurs and having a routine and referring to that routine can be really helpful. For spiritual development, the preschoolers have a basic idea of God, if they're introduced to God in their families, that God is this imaginary friend, and that's how they view God at this point in time. The development of the conscience is strongly linked to spiritual beliefs and to spiritual development. So the conscience of a preschooler in a home where spirituality is is a big part of that family culture will develop faster and more robust than in a home where there is no spiritual development. Now, spirituality doesn't mean religion, so so don't think about it in terms of it has to be a strict religious education, but from a point of spirituality, that there's something bigger than just you in this world. So those little ones' consciousness develop a little bit quicker than if they don't have that overarching spirituality in their home. They begin to think about injury and illness similar to kind of toddlers. We talked about this in the toddler lecture about thinking about it as a punishment. So we just want to be sure that we're communicating that this didn't happen because you did something wrong when they come into us, and just promoting that they're good. We never want any child at any age, we never want to tell the child that they're bad, or we want to communicate to the parents not to tell the child that they're bad, but that what they did was bad. So that was a bad choice, or that it's not good to hit your sister. But you never say you are bad, because a child isn't bad, but what they did was not appropriate, in which case you can call a spade there. And then stressful situations, the religion and the spirituality can be really helpful. And if we're able to maintain some sort of regularity with whatever their spiritual practices were, so if they like to pray before mealtime, or pray at bedtime, or do morning prayers or something like that, that's going to really help them transition if they are having to stay in the hospital. Any familiarity that we can bring in to the hospital is good, and spirituality becomes a part of that individual. So being able to address that and be respectful of that is going to really help that child to transition into being in the hospital for a little while. Social development. So we already kind of talked about this, but we really want to maintain and establish a routine that's going to help these little ones, because they're starting to put that all together. And then they can think, okay, I know I did this, so this comes next. And it gives them a little bit more of a sense of control. And I'm sure when you feel completely out of control, it's hard to be productive. It's hard to listen. It's hard to be kind. So the same thing goes for these little ones. When they feel completely out of control, they're going to have a difficult time in social situations and at home listening to mom and dad. So the more sense of a routine that parents can maintain, or in the hospital, the more sense of a routine that the nurses can maintain throughout the day and the evening, the better off this child is going to be. They really like to have pretend play during this time, and it actually helps them to differentiate between fantasy and reality, because it allows them to have the fantasy time and then the reality time when they have that pretend play. We see a decrease in separation anxiety and stranger anxiety at this time, which is good from the perspective of like preschool drop-off, but bad from the perspective of the stranger anxiety, because we want these little ones to have a little bit of stranger danger, because otherwise who knows what they're going to do and where they're going to go. By the end of the 5th year, they have 2,100 words. So if you remember, by the end of the 1st year, they have 3 to 5 words. By the end of the 2nd year, they have 200 to 300. And by the end of 5 years, they have over 2,100 words. So there's massive amounts of language development going on. They say sentences with a few words in them, 3 to 4 words linked together. They really enjoy talking. As anybody with a preschooler knows, they never shut up. They're just ramble. And they're exploring their language. They're learning it. And it is their primary means of communication. So we have the little babies whose primary means of communication is crying. We have toddlers who have a few words, but who have that really negative talk because they say no to everything, and that's their primary communication. Then when we move on to preschoolers, you can pretty much have a pretty consistent conversation with these little ones using simple words. They're going to start to self-assert at this age as well. So remember the toddlers and the negativism. We see the self-assertion for the preschoolers a little bit different. It's more through independence than the negativism, which is a nice break for parents. You still do see a lot of the no, but it's not quite as much once you move into those preschool years. And that's, again, primarily because they have more language and they have more physical ability to do the things that they want to do. they become aware of their role and their position in the family. So this is a great time to introduce chores. And so the child establishes themselves as their role in the family is somebody who has responsibilities within this family. They will, for the most part, obey warnings for danger, so they hear it, they comprehend it. It does take a few more seconds to comprehend than, say, an adult, but they will, for the most part, listen to those things. The type of play that is utilized by preschoolers is that associative play. So that's where they're all playing together, but they just don't have an established set of goals. There's no leader, there's no end game, if you will. So they're just playing and having fun, but they are interacting with one another, which is different than the parallel play where they're just playing next to each other. They enjoy imaginative and dramatic play, dress-up toys, dress-up clothes, and toy props and things like that are really fun for this age group. And they might have imaginary playmates, and that's okay. Firstborns are more likely to have them, and girls are more likely to have them, but the imaginary playmates are perfectly fine. Boys like to impersonate characters as opposed to having that imaginary playmate. So the girl will have the imaginary playmate where the boy will act as some character in a movie or whatever they might have seen. It really helps them to, again, differentiate the make-believe between the reality. And that's because they are in the make-believe and then they can turn that off and come into reality. So we want the parents to acknowledge the playmate, and if your patient has an imaginary playmate, you can acknowledge them, you can talk to them, you can have them be a part of the interaction. We cannot place the blame for things on the imaginary playmate. So we can't make the imaginary playmate the child's scapegoat. That doesn't work. The child needs to take responsibility for their actions. So we want to educate parents that they should not allow the child to say, oh, well, my imaginary playmate over here broke the glass. No, the child broke the glass, and the child needs to be talked to about what happened if they threw the glass on the floor, whatever it might be. So that's where it comes in, that it's a little bit concerning with the imaginary playmate, is if the child's constantly blaming them for the undesired behaviors that the child is doing. And it is so important for parents and adults to play with the kids at this point in time. This is how they really learn to establish relationships and, get on the floor, play roughhouse with them, tickle them, do puzzles with them, read to them, play that imaginary play. That's my least favorite thing to do, by the way. I hate imaginary play, but and so getting on the floor and just playing with the kids is so important for their social development at this time, and for their development of their self-esteem. So when we're looking at some concerns related to the little toddlers, so we have a transition from preschool to kindergarten, and we actually have a bigger transition from no school or somewhat of like a daycare environment to preschool, which is a little bit more structured, and then into kindergarten, which is typically longer. There's no naps. There's more expected of them. Some of the things we can do to help is that parents can take their child to preschool. They typically don't allow it in kindergarten, but sometimes, and introduce them to the teacher and spend the first couple hours there with the child to help them transition. So if they're having a tough time, that's going to be great to do that the first day. After that, and to set that expectation with the child. Today I'm going to help you learn this, but tomorrow I expect you to go on your own, and to transition the child from having a little bit of a support system to being on their own in that environment. Preschools can be great for learning to work as a group and adjusting to social cultural differences. They learn to cope with frustration and anger and having to share and not being shared with. So little ones who go to preschool are introduced to a lot of different aspects along the way. There's a growth and development table on or it's 33-1, or 33, I think it's actually .1, but it gives you a lot of great tasks and developmental achievements for these little preschoolers. So take a look at that to have a basic understanding of it. Another big area for these preschoolers is fears, stress, and aggression. So preschoolers are afraid of the dark. They're afraid of being left alone, especially at bedtime. They could be afraid of animals like big dogs or little dogs or different types of animals. They are afraid of ghosts. They're afraid of objects or persons that are associated with pain. So that would be you as the nurse. So establishing a relationship with that child outside just doing interventions is so important when you're in the hospital. So if you're constantly going in and just poking and prodding at this kid, they're not going to be happy when the nurse comes in, and they're going to associate the nurse with every nurse that comes in. So you are going to be that person. So it's important that in a pediatric area, nurses go in and they have just a conversation with the child, or they go in and they play with the child, or they go in and they do some comfort measures for the child, as opposed to just always doing interventions that the child could see as harmful. We want kids to be careful with the TV shows that they're watching, or the parents need to be careful with the TV shows that kids are watching, because a lot of the fears come from the TV shows. So we really need to watch watch what the kids are watching. And we want to communicate to parents that the ratings, they're not regulated by anybody. So shows can put ratings on them that have no relevance to what is actually being shown. So children should only be watching TV shows that their parents have already vetted. So that's a really important aspect that we want to communicate, because we don't want these little kids seeing something that their brain can't quite process and then having fears come out of that. So we want them to deal with their fears, and we want to do that by having them come up with, and helping them come up with a practical method to deal with the frightening experience. So for instance, a nightlight, and they can help plug in the nightlight, make them a part of it, making sure there's no monsters in the room. So having mom or dad or the nurse walk around the room and checking, in the cupboard, under the blankets, behind the computer, whatever it might be. These help to reiterate to the child and to enforce that there isn't anything there to be fearful of at that time. We want to ease kids into fearful situations and not necessarily force them. So ease them as long as we can, and just help them to come to it on their own, that even though they're afraid of this, they're going to have to do it. A little bit of stress is okay in life. It helps develop those coping skills. And at this point, there's not a lot of stress on these children, right? They're going through a lot. They're learning a lot. Their bodies are going through a lot, but the mental stress isn't necessarily there. So having a little bit of fear and a little bit of stress every once in a while is really good for these kids, because that's how they learn and how they develop coping skills. But they only have a minimal amount of coping skills. So it really does need to stay minimal. And when we see children who are regressing or who are acting out, we want to kind of ask ourselves those questions. What stressors are in this child's life that's causing this to happen? One thing we also want to keep in mind is language. Although they do have a good amount of language, 2,100 words still isn't all that much. And they might not understand the feelings that they're having. So they might act out of stress or fear or anxiety when they don't know how to communicate what it is that they're feeling. So sometimes we need to give them those words and explore that a little bit further for them. We always want to have progressions for change. So in the hospital setting, especially, if something's going to change for that child, we want to give them a warning and let them know. And parents know this too. You know, you can't just go outside and say, okay, it's time to go. We get major pushback when that happens because the children aren't ready for that. They weren't thinking about that. They're in their game right now. So we need to give them a prep. Hey, you have a 5-minute warning. Or, you know, I know we've done your treatment at before breakfast every morning, but we're going to have to change it to before breakfast and before lunch now. We're not going to do that today, but I just want you to know that that's coming tomorrow. And then at lunchtime, you would go in and say, so remember tomorrow, right around this time, we're going to be doing your treatment again. And that way they have that understanding, they can anticipate it and gives them a little forewarning. Again, that sense of control of their environment, that they're not just being forced to do things, that they're part of what is going on. So with aggression, we want to differentiate aggression versus anger. So aggression looks to hurt a person and looks to destroy property, whereas anger is just a temporary emotional state. So anger is the emotion that's felt. Aggression is when it's outwardly taken out on another person or a property or something. We can see that anger and aggression are increased in boys, and it's also something that is modeled. So if we have parents at home who act out of anger, who act aggressive out of anger, then these children are going to model that as well. And kids are going to get frustrated and they might lead to anger, and that's okay. We want to acknowledge that emotion and let them know that it's what they do with that anger that is important. Sorry, there's somebody walking around my backyard. So I'm like, what? But it's just the bug guy. No more spiders for us, hopefully. So the other thing is if the child acts out and the immediate response is anger and aggression, then that reinforces those behaviors in that child. So if we're seeing that a lot in a hospitalized child, then we might want to have a little gentle conversation with the parents about what we're seeing in their behaviors and ask them how they behave towards the child, and let them know that the child is probably modeling, and the fact that they're doing it reinforces it. And then the fact that the child is punished because of their aggressive responses is also going to reinforce it. Remember, attention is attention. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad for a kid who's not getting any. They just want attention. So with frustration, we want to talk through that and help them to move past it and help them to deal with it. We don't want negative reinforcements for frustrated things, because that's going to lead to acting out. We want to look at the number of occurrences when it comes to anger and aggression specifically. And if there are multiple occurrences, then it might be time to seek professional help. So we're going to look at how long they last and how many occurrences are occurring. The critical time for language development is between 2 and 4 years, and it's because so many of those neurons are connecting, and it is a huge jump from 200 words to 2,000 words. We might see some delays in the language development. Some things that we can discuss with parents is if we hear stammering or stuttering, that's typically not a indication of a larger problem. Usually what it is that their tongue can't keep up with their brain. So what's going on in their head, they're just not able to articulate quite yet out of their mouth. So usually if stuttering and stammering occurs past 4, then that might be something that we'll end up sending a referral for to see a speech therapist. But in those initial preschool years, it's a commonplace for kids to stutter and stammer just because they don't have the sensory motor function and control to adequately express what is trying to come out of their mouth. But if we do see some sort of language development delay, we want to provide a referral as soon as possible. So if we think that there's a speech delay, if we think that there's some sort of hearing problem, if we think there's a problem with articulation, then the earlier that we can get a referral and get treatment, the better the outcome's going to be. So how do we promote health during this time? We're back to nutrition, shocker. So with nutrition, preschoolers eat about half the amount that adults do. They still might be finicky, picky eaters, probably until about 5. They're still going to really like those plain foods with not a lot of flavor. So, and they're developing taste buds and, again, control over their environment. They need adequate protein and fiber and calcium, folate, vitamins A and C. Your book has some great specifics if you're interested. Don't worry, I'm not going to test you on the number of MUs that they need of iron or anything like that. But it's kind of fun to look at just to see what the differences are. We want their fat to be about 20 to 30% of their diet, but with less than 10% being saturated fat. So really watching those packaged foods. We really want these preschoolers and anybody, I mean, eating healthy is eating the fresh foods and not the processed foods. They should be eating 5 servings of fruit and vegetables a day. And again, this is a question that's asked in those pediatric appointments. I had to take my middle one to the doctor yesterday, and I was asked, do you offer her 5 servings of fruit and vegetables every day? Does she wear a helmet? So all those questions that I've mentioned along the way, these really do get asked at the pediatrician's office. We really want to make sure that they're not eating and drinking things fortified with sugar. So no sweetened fruit juices, no sweetened beverages, sodas aren't good. Excuse me, we want them to have less than 2 hours of screen time and at least an hour of physical activity. This is all going to contribute to them just being healthy. So preschoolers should sleep about 12 hours total in a day, and some preschoolers nap and some don't. This is about the time that they start to give up the nap, and when they give it up varies from child to child. They might start to have some sleep disturbances, so night terrors are really common with preschoolers. And just providing comfort and and soothing voice to the children during this time is really important. They need a consistent bedtime routine. A nightlight really helps them fall asleep. Having a favorite toy that they find comfort in. Parents can leave water at the bedside, no juices, no milk, but just water so that they can get up and have a sip of water if they need to. And just give them, establish that bedtime routine, whether it's reading books, singing songs, saying prayers, all 3, whatever it might be. So the child, that it's a transition, and we're telling them, okay, now it's time to lay down and go to sleep, and we're giving them that opportunity to transition into being on their own. As for dental health, their deciduous teeth are all coming in at this time. They should have just about everything. We want the parents to still be doing the majority of the dental care. We're transitioning to the child doing some, but the parents should still daily be at least participating in the brushing and flossing of the teeth. And then it's important that we communicate to parents that the dentist is called with any sort of trauma to the teeth, because those deciduous teeth, what happens to them is going to affect the permanent teeth. So if there's trauma, we want them to call the dentist, even if they just knock out a baby tooth, because there could be some sort of trauma to that permanent tooth as well. We're going to make sure that they are wearing their helmets and their protective pads when they're out riding any sort of wheeled toy. And we also want to prevent them from bodily harm. So if we want to communicate that if there's guns in the home, they need to be locked up. We're going to communicate the stranger safety. So that they should not be talking to strangers at all. And make sure that, trampolines are safely, there's no safe trampoline. I have one, but it's just the way it is. I fully understand that it's a huge safety concern. And growing up, we had about 5 broken bones from our trampolines, but they're still they're a great way to get out those little kids' energies. So, but we should be recommending that parents at least have the net around the trampoline, or that they're cognizant of what's going on when those kids are out there in that trampoline. We want to be conscientious of burns. So not only from hot fluid and hot pans, but also sunburns. We want these kids to be wearing sunscreen. Drowning is big during this time as well. So teaching these kids to swim is really important so that they're water safe, and making sure that there's fences around the pools and all of that stuff. And they should still be sitting in a car seat at this point in time. So we just want to make sure that they have the appropriate car seat. We want to start to teach them some pedestrian safety. So how do you cross a street? What do you do when you want to go into the parking lot? For the anticipatory guidance for this area, we're looking at a shift from protection to education. So we're starting to teach these little ones more, as opposed to just protecting them from doing it. So like we just talked about with the crossing the street, instead of just grabbing the child and going across the street, we're going to stop. We're going to look. We're going to teach the child, okay, we look both ways before we cross the street. Sorry, I have funny glares. I haven't looked yet. I'm almost done. So now we'll fix it for you. But we want, so we're having that shift from just automatically protecting that child to teaching them how to protect themselves. Although the parents still need to provide a very active role. And we as nurses, when we're the primary caregivers in the hospital situation, we still need to provide a very active role in the protection. But there is a little bit of that shift. And then injury prevention, we want to discuss having the bookcases attached to the wall and all that fun stuff. And then this area, we might also have a shift for mom. If you have somebody who's stayed at home with this child, there's a bit of a shift when the child goes to school for the first time, or if it's a hospitalized child. So when we as healthcare providers can discuss some of those concerns with the parents. Infectious conditions, it says communicable diseases. Sorry, I'm blocking that. So what we want to do primarily is prevent the spread. So we do that with a couple things, which you guys know very well. So immunization is going to be our primary prevention of the spread of most communicable diseases. We also want to teach good hand washing, and for you guys, standard precautions are key. So know your standard precautions when it comes to contact versus droplet versus airborne, right? So we want to make sure that we are using the appropriate protective equipment based off of why the child is in the hospital. And we want to teach kids to wash their hands, because they're touching everything and their hands go right in their mouths, right? So wash their hands. We also want to teach kids how to appropriately cover their mouth, coughing into your elbow as opposed to into your hand. And teach them not to share drinks and not to share utensils, so that we're minimizing the spread of potential diseases and potential microorganisms. Some kids are at a higher risk. So we have immunocompromised kids who are going to be at a much higher risk for developing any sort of infection. There's multiple complications that can occur with infections. And so by preventing the spread, we can hopefully prevent some of those complications. If you take a look at 33.2 in your book, the table, it lists all sorts of communicable diseases of childhood. So take a gander at that, just look and see what it is that are the most common and what we as healthcare professionals can do to, one, help prevent the spread, and then two, how do we treat all these things? What are we going to do for these little ones when they get this? This picture here is a little girl with roseola, which is a virus that occurs in kids, and typically just they get this bright red rash all over their body. The rash itself doesn't bother them, but they usually have a temperature and are lethargic and feel a little bit down. So this little one has roseola. So I mentioned earlier that we were going to discuss abuse a little bit. And this is always a very hard topic, because obviously nobody in their right mind wants a child to be abused. But there's various types of child maltreatment. And you, as a healthcare provider, even as a student nurse, are a mandated reporter. You will be for the rest of your life now. So if you suspect anything, you're mandated to report it. And that doesn't mean that the person's going to go to jail. It just means that an investigation is going to take place and to determine what's going on. So child neglect is one of the most common. About 34% of maltreatment deaths are from neglect. And this is not providing the child what they need. So either food, clothing, adequate hygiene, availability, and even emotional support, or emotional connectiveness. Those all go into neglect. It could be a lack of resources or a lack of knowledge. So we want to address some of those issues early on. And that's why a lot of those questions are asked at the pediatric appointments, so that we can identify knowledge gaps and fill them before it becomes a neglect issue. When it comes to physical abuse, there's a couple different avenues that physical abuse can take. And it's, we're always, again, going to want to report it. So if we see bruises in various stages, if we have stories that don't quite add up, those are all signs of abuse. There is a table in the book also that goes through the signs of abuse and kind of what to do with a child who is reporting abuse. There's Munchausen syndrome, which is very rare, but it's such an interesting and devastating syndrome, to where the mother is making the child sick so that she can get attention. And sometimes this ends in death, because she's slowly poisoning the child, or breaking their bones, or something else. So one of the keys for Munchausen syndrome, how we determine that, is if the mother's removed from the situation, the symptoms go away. So if the child comes in really sick and the mother's not able to truly access the child to the level that she had been at home, and all of a sudden 2 or 3 days later that child's perfectly fine, then that's going to be a warning sign for Munchausen syndrome. Shaken baby syndrome is on here because it's so serious. And this really, really comes down to education, because what happens is these babies start to cry. And it can happen all the way into preschoolers, and their little heads aren't totally developed. And if the parent shakes them so violently, and I've mentioned this before, but that there's a brainstem separation and a traumatic brain injury can occur. So these children typically don't die. They're just severely brain damaged. When we're looking at sexual abuse, the book gives a good definition of sexual abuse that comes from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So take a look at that. But it can be anything from incest, molestation, exhibitionism, child pornography, child prostitution, pedophilia. So again, a child who becomes withdrawn, a child who regresses, a child who is inappropriately sexual with their friends or with their toys are all warning signs of sexual abuse going on. And then remember, as I've said before, you are a mandated reporter. So that's a step that you can do. You're going to report this to the authorities so that it can truly be investigated. Some other aspects that we're going to look at is we want to provide private time to talk to the child. We're not going to ever promise them that we're not going to tell people, because we need to tell people. We're going to tell them, we're going to be truthful with them. We're going to tell them that we're required to report the abuse. we don't want to express shock, or we don't want to criticize the family members or whoever the abuser is. We just kind of want to listen. We want to use their vocabulary to discuss their body parts. So if it's a girl and she's calling her vagina a hoo-ha, then we're going to use that terminology because that's what she's comfortable with at that time. We don't want to use any sort of leading statements. We want to reassure them that they've done the right thing. And then also it's so important to reassure them that the abuse is not their fault, because that's what they start to internalize, that this is done to me because of something I did, and this is my fault, and this is on me. And so we want to ensure that it is not their fault and they are not to blame. We're going to look at their immediate need for safety. What do we need to do to ensure they're safe immediately? And let the child know what will happen when we file the report, so that people will come talk to them. They can expect to be talked to by the authorities. They can expect that the abuser will be talked to by the authorities. So the child has an understanding of what's going to come next. There should always be a family-nurse partnership, especially when it comes to preventing abuse. So we can prevent abuse through education. And it's important to bring up these things in the environment with the child, so that we can educate the child when it comes to sexual abuse. So physical abuse, sometimes it does come down to education for the parents, but sexual abuse, we want to educate the child. So around this time, it's important to start the talks about nobody should be touching your private areas except for you, and nobody should ever be making you take your underwear off, and if it doesn't feel right, you need to tell a trusted adult, and things of that nature. So we can educate adults when it comes to some of the maltreatments, but it's really important to provide the education to the child when it comes to sexual abuse. So we end on such a happy note. These little preschoolers are magical little creatures who are learning so much and developing so rapidly. And as always, feel free to reach out to me via text, email, or come to office hours if you have any questions.